Okay, so we'll get started. My name is Anita Nickerson. I'm the Executive Director of Fair Vote Canada. And before I go any further, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations and communities across Canada. These lands have been inhabited by Indigenous people since time immemorial. I live in Kitchener, Ontario, and I'm on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee people. So how we are going to do this webinar is Dennis is going to talk for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, I'm not sure, go over basic overview of proportional representation, what it is and what the basic systems are for Canada. If you have questions for Dennis, put them in the Q&A. So the questions in the Q&A will be, I'll pick a few and toss them to Dennis afterward. And the chat is for you to say hello to other people and to chat with people who are joining us, other attendees that are on the webinar. Okay, so we will get started and I'll turn it over to Dennis. Thank you very much, Dennis.
All right. Well, hello, everyone. And look, my apologies for not getting here promptly at 7. And I appreciate those of you who could rearrange your plans and join us now. And of course, apologies to those who had to go. I hope that we'll have a recording that will serve the purposes. You know, we do this one-on-one on a regular basis. Let me say before I get started that I go into a lot more detail in some of the materials that I prepared. I have a book called The Politics of Voting, which makes the case for proportional representation in Canada. It may seem a bit dated now. It came out a number of years ago, but I think the basic arguments are still there. And so if you want to dig a little deeper, it's available for free on my Academia EDU site. You just Google Dennis Pilon. It'll be one of the first things there. And you can really dig into a lot of different aspects of the topic if you want to know. And you're welcome to email me. My institutional address is available on that site and on my York site. So you can send me your own questions directly if you want. Why don't I start by sharing my screen? I'm going to see if this screen sharing thing works. Looks like it's going to. So let me see if I can get that. Oh, there it is. Very good. And now I am going to hit start on the slideshow. There we go. So hopefully what you're seeing now is my title slide that says the ABCs of voting systems. Now, I don't know if Anita can just let me know if that's all running well. Yep, looking good. I'm going to swift to here's our first change of scene. And I want to start very basically with, and I'm not assuming that you know anything about voting systems, those of you who've tuned in. So I'm going to start very, very basic. But again, when we get into the questions, we can go a bit deeper. So what is a voting system? When we talk about a voting system, it's obviously part of a larger set of institutions that we use politically in any given country. The voting system is a very specific set of rules that translate votes into representation. So that's the job that the voting system does. And all voting systems comprise three parts. So there is a districting rule, a balloting rule, and a formula that determines winners. So wherever we go in the world, we can look at the voting system they have, and they will fit into one of these. Each will have all three of these parts. So let me start with the districting rule. Districting rule just determines how many people will be elected in a particular area. And of course, we know in the Canadian context, we have single member ridings for most of our contests for municipal elections or provincial elections or for federal elections. Just one person will get elected in a geographic area with boundaries around it. But it's also possible to have a number of people elected from one geographic area. And some of you from Vancouver already know that Vancouver uses a multi-member riding for its city council elections. So we actually have examples of both voting systems where we use single or multi-member districting rules. Now, you can also combine your choice of district rule with the ballot structure that you see when you go in. When you get the ballot, what does it look like? Does it ask you to just make an X or a check? Or does it ask you to number your choices? Does it ask you to rank them? And so your voting system has a distinction in terms of the structure of the way it asks you for the information. And then each voting system has a formula that determines how you win. And so in the Canadian context, the formula is plurality. You just need more votes than any other single person. As long as you've got more than any other single person, no matter how little it is, and no matter how many other people combined have more votes than you, as long as you've got more votes than any other single person, you've won a plurality. But of course, sometimes a voting system asks for a majority to win. And some of us are aware of that already, that our leadership contests involve getting a majority of the vote. They don't let somebody, they don't like Mark Carney be the leader of the Liberal Party with just a plurality. He has to have a majority of the votes to get that particular position. And then the final formula is proportional. So instead of asking you to have a plurality or a majority, now you only need a quota, a certain amount of support. If there's 5 members to be elected, then the quota is often 1/5 of the total, 20%, around there. So all voting systems have 3 parts: districting rule, ballot structure, and formula. And depending on how you combine these different things together, it creates different voting systems. So that's the kind of internal workings. If we pull up the hood on voting systems, this is what we see underneath. Now, when we put these component parts together, we can create lots of different voting systems. But essentially, they fall within 3 families of voting systems. So yeah, you can find a lot of interesting differences. I mean, I just talked to you about a single member plurality, the system we use for provincial and federal elections in Canada. But I also mentioned to you multi-member plurality, which is the system they use in Vancouver. So within the families, you've got different choices. So here are the 3 families of voting systems. We've got what we call winner-take-all systems, where one person gets the representation, as I say, regardless of how much other people want somebody else. It's a winner-take-all. Whatever the formula is, they get it all. Or there's proportional representation. And proportional representation, again, there's 3 main systems and then many, many, many variations. But usually they're just riffing on one of these 3 main systems. And then we have what are called semi-proportional systems. And semi-proportional systems do a slightly better job of representing, diversity, representing, different points of view, but they often fall short of providing a legislature that really does reflect the full diversity of the choices that voters have made with their votes. So it kind of falls somewhere in between. Now, if we break down those families, in the winner-take-all category, we've got plurality elections and we've got majority elections. Under proportional representation, we've got party list systems, single transferable vote systems, and mixed member proportional systems. And then with semi-proportional, we've got what are called parallel systems, the limited vote, and the cumulative vote. And I'm going to go into some details about all of these right now. So let's talk a little bit about how they work. How do the different systems create the results? And let's start with plurality, which should be the one we know best, because that's the one that in most instances we're using in the Canadian context. Now, as I said, this can be either single or multi-member. And it's important to remember that while we have the example of municipal multi-member plurality, and there are jurisdictions all across Canada that are using multi-member plurality at the local level, it was also used at the provincial and federal level historically. So we can find examples in various provinces, particularly in urban areas, where you would see in Vancouver or Winnipeg multi-member ridings, sometimes 4 members, sometimes 10 members. And at the federal level, there was a series of dual member ridings that existed from 1867 to 1966. So we don't have those anymore in any of those jurisdictions, but we did in the past. So what happens? How does somebody win? Well, in our example election that I put up here, we've got Party A, Party B, and Party C. And as you can see, Party A got 40 votes. That's more than either the Party B candidate or the Party C candidate. Now, Party B and Party C together have more votes than Party A, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because Party A has more votes than any other single candidate. And so that means they win. They don't need a majority. They might have a majority, and sometimes in our plurality elections, somebody will get a majority of the votes, but they don't need it. They only need a plurality to win. Now, this system, single member plurality or first past the post, again, winner take all, this is used in Canada, it's used in the United Kingdom, it's used in the United States. And that's pretty much it amongst Western countries. There are a few other countries around the world that use plurality. But in terms of countries that are similar to us, that we can make comparisons to, very few countries are left using plurality. And as I mentioned already, we do have the example of multi-member plurality still in use municipally in Vancouver and in a number of other locales in Canada. Let's turn our attention to majority voting. So in majority voting, a candidate needs more than a plurality. Now the candidate usually needs a majority. Now, I'm just going to put a little brackets here because in actual fact, even in majority systems, sometimes candidates win without a majority. But let's put that in the weeds for the moment. For the most part, the idea is that for a candidate to win a single member riding, they need a majority of the vote to win. And there's two main systems that do this: the alternative vote or the double ballot. Now, you may know the alternative vote by its a sexier, more modern name, ranked ballots. Um, it's problematic because, of course, as I've already described, you can have ranked ballots in both majority and PR systems. So it's kind of wrong to call the alternative vote the ranked ballot, but nevertheless, that's what people are doing. Anyway, what's important is that you understand the logic of how it operates. So these two main approaches to doing majority voting. Now, the first example, this is the system they use in France, and it's called the double ballot or two-round voting. In the first round, everybody goes out and votes in those ridings. And if somebody gets a majority, they win. And that's done. That riding is finished. But if you have a riding where no one has won a majority of the votes, well, now there'll be a second election, usually maybe 2 weeks later. Sometimes some parties drop out so that the contest is more narrow. Sometimes they don't. It just depends on what the rules are. But in our example here, in the first round, and here you can see I've cleverly, sort of reproduced the plurality results from the previous example. Party A back with their 40 votes, but this time it's not enough. Under the majority voting system, they do not win the riding with just 40 votes. And 2 weeks later, interestingly enough, the voters decided that if push came to shove, they preferred Party B to Party A. And so you can see here how a majority voting system can lead to a very different result, even though the votes are exactly the same. The votes are exactly the same in terms of the first section of this election, but in the second section, voters made other choices. Now, the other version of majority voting, again, I've called it the alternative vote, or you might know it as ranked ballot. In this case, instead of having one election and then another election, they just get it all done at once. And so under alternative voting, the voters rank the parties, 1, 2, 3. You can rank as much as you want or as little as you want, unless the rules say otherwise. And in our example, 5 Party C supporters chose Party A as their second choice, while 20 chose Party B, giving Party B the win. So we're sort of intimating here that under AV we'd have the same results. We're sort of, for the purposes of this example, I'm just using the same one. And now I'm basically describing how people ranked the ballots to get the result. So basically, people gave their first choices to these parties A, B, and C. And then they had a second choice that they wanted to make. And so, as I said, Party C voters, well, they're in the ranked ballot approach. After the first round of voting, if no one has a majority, then the bottom vote getter drops off. And all of their ballots are redistributed on the basis of the second choices. And so when we break up those Party C voters in terms of the second choices, now we discover that 20 chose Party B, and only 5 chose Party A. And so that gave Party B the win. The alternative vote has been used for a long time, over 100 years in Australia, so it has lots of experience with it. And we also used it in Canada in the past. We used it for 35 years for rural elections in Alberta and Manitoba, and it was used for 2 elections in British Columbia in the 1950s. Whereas, as I've already mentioned, the double ballot is used in France. Let's turn to PR, or proportional representation. Now, as I mentioned, in this situation, voters don't need a plurality, or rather, candidates don't need a plurality, and they don't need a majority to win a seat. Instead, you get a seat by winning a quota. This is how the results end up being proportional, because instead of asking people to win a plurality in a single member riding, and then, that's what leads to some of the distortions we see in terms of the gap between the votes that were cast for a party and the seats they get. Because look, if you've got a party winning seats with 40% of the vote, I mean, you could have a party that wins every riding in the country with 40%. They'd have 100% of the seats, but, it wouldn't reflect what people had voted for. So in a PR system, they don't ask for a plurality or majority. They only ask someone to win a quota. And, basically, if we go back to our example of Party A, Party B, and Party C, and we look at those initial results, if Party A gets 45% of the votes, they get 45% of the seats. And same for Party B, 35 equals 35% of the seats, 25% of the votes gets 25% of the seats. Now, the different systems I described to you do this in different ways, whether you're using a party list or you're using mixed member proportional or single transferable vote. And the process by which that occurs is more complicated than what you would see under a plurality voting system. I often say to people, plurality is simple to count, but it's not necessarily simple to understand in terms of why the parties ended up with what they did. PR is the opposite. PR is not so easy to count, but when the results emerge, you go, oh, that makes sense. Yeah, somebody got 25% of the votes and they got roughly 25% of the seats. That makes, intuitive sense to us. As I mentioned, most Western countries use proportional systems. If we break down how they do this in terms of the different systems, just look at my clock here, make sure I'm not running out of time. Under party list system, these are the systems they use in Sweden and Finland and Norway and Denmark and Holland. The votes are added up for the parties and the seats are awarded proportionately. Now, in some cases, the whole country is one riding, and that's true in Israel and the Netherlands. The whole country is just one constituency. But the Scandinavian and Benelux countries, the Benelux countries, Holland and Belgium, they elect from districts that average about 20 MPs. So they elect from smaller, not the whole country, but instead they break up the country into a number of multi-member constituencies, which obviously brings the results a little closer to where people are voting. They also have different rules that they apply to how to do it. Some have what are called open lists, some have what are called closed lists. So on an open list, the voters can sometimes alter the order of how the candidates come off the party list into the legislature. In other cases, they're not allowed to do that. It just depends on the country. Sometimes it depends on the party. Sometimes the party rules determine whether or not the lists are open or closed. Now, a very popular approach to PR in Canada historically had been the single transferable vote. And SDV was the choice of most Anglo-American countries. Australia uses the single transferable vote for its Senate elections. And many of the local elections in Australia or New Zealand use the single transferable vote as their choice of PR. And of course, we also used SDV in Canada at the provincial level. It was used for municipal elections in Winnipeg for 50 years. No, 35 years. I'm thinking the civic level for 50 years. And also in Calgary and Edmonton. And then civically, it was used in 29 municipalities across Western Canada. So literally millions of Canadians have used the single transferable vote in the past. So again, in this case, MPs are elected by gaining a quota of the total votes. SDV ridings, if we use the example of Ireland, which has the most experience of using SDV for their legislative elections, they typically elect 3 to 5 members. If you think about a 5-member riding, then the quota to get elected is roughly about 20%. 1/5 of the total votes will get you a seat. Voters rank their candidates, usually across the same party, but the system doesn't insist you do that. And so it gives voters quite a bit of latitude. If they want to support someone from a different party, they can do that. They can rank their choices 1, 2, 3, 4 across one party, or they can rank it across different parties, whatever they see fit. They're left in charge. As I mentioned, it's been used in Ireland since World War I, so over a century of experience of using the system. Historic use in Canada and Australia. Actually, a lot of American cities have experience with using the single transferable vote. New York City elected its city council using the single transferable vote in the 1940s and 1950s. Now, another method, remember we had 3 main methods of doing PR. And so the one that's the most recently popular is what's called mixed member proportional. And this system combines 2 different ways of electing MPs to get one overall result. Some MPs are elected in single member ridings, just like we do. Looks exactly the same as what we do. Voters have a list of candidates for the different parties. They go to the local polling station. They put an X by the name of the one that they like. But at the same time, in the same election, some MPs are elected from party lists. And so voters can have one vote, and sometimes that vote will apply to both. In some cases, they have 2 votes. So they might have a vote for the local MP, and then the ballot might also ask them for their party choice. It's really very simple to vote this way when you look at the ballot that someone has to use. And I meant to put some ballots in here. I apologize, I didn't get to that. Really, often they just have two things they have to fill in. What's the local candidate they're choosing? What's the party choice they prefer? Or as I say, in some cases, they just combine it all into one, where, whatever candidate you chose for the local riding, it is assumed that the party for that candidate is your party choice as well. Now, when they get down to counting the results, it goes in two stages. So they do the single member riding results first and work out who has won what in the ridings. And then they tally the party results. And what they can do here is that they can compare the results in the riding to what should be the overall results for the parties in the election. And then they make them work. So in my election example, maybe Party A wins 30 local seats in a 100-member House and 40% of the party vote. In that case, they would gain 10 more seats from their party list because they would need 10 more seats to have won 40% of the total seats. That's how the system, by combining these two elements, ends up with an overall proportional result. And as I mentioned, this is the system has been used in Germany since the end of World War II, and has more recently been adopted in New Zealand back in 1996. So they've actually had now a quarter century of experience using MMP for their elections as well. And of course, New Zealand is a very great comparison with Canada, same constitutional inheritance, same parliamentary system, so very, very similar in terms of making a case that what's happening there could look like what might happen here with the same opportunity. When we debate voting systems, it's often debated in terms of pros and cons. I'm not really fond of this way because I'm not sure really there are any pros for our current system, not at least from a democratic standpoint. But, stick with me here for a moment and I'll run through what you'll hear from other political scientists. So typically you'll hear people say things like, well, winner take all. What are the pros? It tends to produce majority government. It has an element of local representation. And it's argued it has clear accountability. Because there's a majority government, you know who did what was what, and you can throw those rascals out at the next election. They can't weasel out of responsibility for what they did. On the con side, the majority governments we elect are almost never real majority governments. They don't reflect a majority of the voting population. In fact, since 1921, we've only had 3 governments that gained a majority of the popular vote, even though we've had 30-odd elections since that time. And of course, the local representation positive is really only local representation for some, and sometimes a very small group. So if people are winning with 40% of the vote in a local riding, frankly, the other 60% have got to do without. I mean, sure, that local representative will help you with some query that you have, and that's all well and good. But really, what are people voting for? They're voting for the different policies that the parties represent. And frankly, you're not going to get any love from somebody who's not with the party that you wanted, right? You're not going to go to a party that doesn't support the policy you want and say, you should do what I want. They're not going to do it. So in that sense, those people don't really have the local representation that's promised. And it's not clear how to measure accountability given the workings of the way the system operates. I mean, the system is not that competitive. So how do you make people accountable if you can't increase the competition and allow voters to choose? And what does accountability mean when a party is elected with 40% of the vote and the majority of people actually didn't want what they're trying to introduce? It's a curious concept. On the proportional side, the pros, well, it's more accurate representation. If there are majority governments, they're real majority governments. They have to be a coalition, or if it's one party, they have to represent an actual majority of the people. PR systems have more competitive party systems. So if people don't like what parties are doing, they can vote for other parties. And not just for the party that's the opposite of what they like. They can vote for a party that is close to what they believe in. And it's more responsive to voters in terms of making sure that every vote counts. On the con side, critics complain, PR systems offer fewer single-party majority governments, less clear-cut election results, a slower policy process, and these are very typical complaints that we hear about PR systems, but I would argue they're not actually supported empirically. I mean, do you think majority governments that aren't earned are a good thing? Personally, I don't. I think the election results are fairly clear cut in terms of what people want. The votes tell the story. A slower policy process is not necessarily a bad thing if we can build a greater constituency to support those policies once the government is in office. So again, all of the things that we hear about this debate are debatable, and I don't think are as supported as some of the critics of PR might have you believe. Okay, let me come to my last theme, and then I want to open things up to, your questions. How should we decide what kind of voting system that we have? Now, as a prelude to this, I just want to remind you that nobody asked anybody about the institutional structures that we ended up with in this country. They were all established in the pre-democratic era of Canadian history. The country wasn't founded as a democracy. I mean, in 1867, a very small group of white men, rich white men, were allowed to vote. It was a long time, in fact, 25 years before most, even just white working class men could vote, and then longer for white working class women, and then longer to restore the voting rights of Indigenous Canadians and Canadians of color. So, it's not a nice story of our democratic past. It really has been a tooth and nail fight. So that's the situation we're in. We've ended up with a system that's kind of rigged against democracy, and now we're fighting an uphill battle to bring some democracy into that system. How should we make the decision? Well, one view says that the issue is a constitutional issue, that we need a referendum. This is the conservative position that has come out, except when it isn't, right? I mean, Doug Ford got rid of the ranked ballots for local government with just a law. He just erased it. So he didn't think he needed a referendum to do that. But when we're talking about at the federal level, we often hear that we need a referendum, or at the provincial level. Some say that we should make the decision on the basis of values and goals. And so, in this view, the choice of voting system is a matter of taste, as is how to implement it. So, if you like majority governments, well, then that's okay. And if you don't like majority governments, then that's okay too. This is the liberal position, a kind of relativistic one. I don't think either of these are defensible. We've had lots of use of different voting systems. They didn't require a referendum. In fact, we've had 10 voting system reforms in this country historically. Not one of them was introduced with a referendum. They were all introduced just by passage of legislation. In terms of values and goals, frankly, I don't think giving a majority to a party that hasn't earned it is a value that we should be supporting. As I say, there are lots of arguments in favor of first past the post. They're just not democratic ones. If democracy is our goal, then a lot of the values that supposedly sustain these other systems go out the window. To me, we should decide on the basis of democracy. It's not a matter of taste, but a matter of the right to democratic equality. Every person has a right to see their vote count equally in the calculation of representation in this country. Government should introduce the system that best achieves that. So we should try to figure out what voters are doing when they vote. We know they're voting for parties. We know that that's the most important thing to them. So we should have a system that makes that happen. So this is my case for PR now. Canadians struggle to get their democratic will through our mostly pre-democratic institutions like our voting system. The choice of the voting systems should match up with what voters are trying to do with how to best get such results. We know from the academic study that people vote party, that party choice is the key factor influencing their vote. But our current voting system privileges geography in tabulating the votes, even though no one really votes for geographic representation, not as their first priority. Our voting system should equalize voting power as much as possible, increase the power to elect for every voter. As I've suggested, arguments exist for winner-take-all voting systems, but they're just not democratic ones. By contrast, the alleged risks that are often highlighted with PR are that system might be too democratic. All right, that's what I have to present, and now I'm interested to hear what you want to talk about. I'm going to stop sharing.
All right, thank you, Dennis. We really appreciate that overview. And we don't usually ask Dennis to go into the mechanics of the different systems and stuff. That's something we generally try to stay away from, but often people are wanting that basic overview. So I hope that it's been helpful to hear about the three different kinds of PR and how they all basically deliver the same thing. Fair results, local representation, more collaborative politics, more democracy. So I wanted to start with a question. It's actually one of the lower ones in the Q&A, and I'll just sum it up. Someone is saying, if we have PR federally, would we have perpetual minority governments? And if that was the case, would that mean that we'd never be able to pass any new legislation?
Yeah, I mean, these are the kind of things that we often hear from the critics, who, speculate that if we adopted a PR system, nothing would ever get done. And I guess I wonder why they don't look at Europe. I mean, Europe has been using PR now, in some cases 100 years, in some cases pretty solidly for 70 or 80 years. Um, and they pass lots of legislation. They get lots of things done. Most of the European countries, the Western European countries, have some of the best economic performance amongst the G8 countries or the G12 countries. They have very robust welfare states. They have very effective representation. They represent not just the ideological diversity of the country, but also the demographic diversity. They have better gender representation, better diversity of rural versus urban. I mean, however you measure it, they are doing a better job. They're inclusive, and yet they are still able to govern effectively. And I always remember a comment from one of the prime ministers of Holland who said, "Yeah, it takes us a little longer to get things done, but the process we use makes sure that the policies that we pass have broad support. And because they have broad support, they actually work." As opposed to policy that's rammed through by a government with 40% of the popular vote.
I would also say too, we can just look at the difference between minority governments with proportional representation and minority governments with a winner-take-all system. There's all we know is minority with the winner-take-all, where the incentives are really messed up. If anybody's watching the whole fiasco around the budget, going on right now, instead of any attempt at collaboration, it's just a whole bunch of political games. That's not what it would be like with a proportional system. I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit,
Yeah,
Dennis.
very briefly, Anita, that's a great point, and it's really, really important to understand that the strategic incentives that different voting systems create will be very different in the different systems. In our system, no politician can give anything to another politician from another party because it's a winner-take-all battle in every single riding. So if they say something nice about another party, they're helping another party beat them. So, I mean, structurally, the system doesn't encourage collaboration and common sense. In a PR system, there's no advantage to calling an early election or grandstanding because you go to the electorate, the results are probably not going to be that much different. You're not going to get the exaggerated differences. In our system, a very small movement of votes can lead to a dramatic change in the representation, but that's not the case in PR. And so the behavior of the politicians changes.
Absolutely. And with PR, we do get majority governments. They're just not single party
Yes.
majority governments, which is the difference, right? It doesn't all boil down to one person's opinion in some back room. So a few people are noting that you talked about how Alberta and Manitoba at one time used proportional representation. So they did use it in the cities, and then they used the winner take all version in the rural area. And they're wondering what happened to that? How come they ended up getting first past the post back?
So yeah, this is a really good example of the difference between taking up a winner-take-all system or a semi-proportional system and a proportional system. Because semi-proportional systems, because they're not fully proportional, still allow parties with less than a majority of support to win a majority of the seats. And then even though these systems didn't lead to complaints from voters didn't have any problems using them, but eventually politicians found reasons to get rid of them. And because it was a semi-proportional system, they could engineer the circumstances to return to plurality. Whereas most of Europe shifted to PR around World War I, and in part, conservative elites were concerned that these working class voters were going to outnumber them. So they quickly moved to PR, not because they were Democrats, but because they wanted to limit the power. They didn't want them to have a massive majority. But after the World War, it turned out that the working class weren't as threatening as they thought they were, and they wanted to go back to the old systems, but they couldn't because PR meant that they could never get the group together that would take the risk to go back to the old system.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting when you switch from, first past the post to say a winner take all ranked ballot. You're either going to get stuck with winner take all ranked ballot forever, or you're going to get first past the post back. Whereas when you switch to proportional representation, for the most part, you keep proportional representation because once people have fair representation, those parties don't want to give that up, right? So that's sort of basically it.
It's a game of chicken. It's a game of chicken, right? Like, I mean, you're there's a reason that not a single one of the ex-communist countries adopted first past the post. Not one. Not a single one. Not a single one of the countries returning to democracy from authoritarian governments in Latin America or authoritarian governments in Southern Europe, not one adopted first past the post because the risks are too great that you'll get the wrong end of the stick. You'll be the one who gets dramatically underrepresented. So all the political forces had an interest in seeing that all of their votes were counted up fairly.
All right. Somebody has a question about independence. So there's been a lot of talk about parties, and they're just wanting to know in a proportional system, can independents run and win?
What's interesting here is that all the systems have some kind of accommodation where independents can find a way in. Because PR systems are more competitive, what we've seen in some cases is that sometimes independents run as their own party, and they get elected as a party of one. And so that's always possible. But it's important to remember that there's a reason why people tend to vote for parties. And it's in political science, we call it a information shortcut. Most unlike you. I mean, you people here, you are unique. Let's face it. You've come to an event that wants to talk about institutions. Now, I'm pretty sure that most of your friends and relatives are like, no thanks. That's not how I'm going to spend my Sunday night. Right? So let's just admit that we're all a little different here in terms of like our interests. We find this stuff interesting, but most people don't. And so most people, they'll struggle to figure out what's going on in politics without some kind of weather vane. And that's why party voting is so consistent. If you look at the results in Canada or in Ontario or any of our provinces, you'll find that between 95 and 99% of the voters are voting for parties. And there's a reason for that. It's because it helps them to figure out what's going on. And we know this is true because when we look at, for instance, municipal elections, sometimes where there aren't parties, voter turnout is dramatically lower because voters are struggling to try to figure out what do all these politicians represent. I don't know what they're going to do with their power. So I get you. I know a lot of you are concerned that you want a situation where you can vote for parties, but also maybe there's some independent that would be good. What I can say is that all the PR systems have some way of that occurring. SDV is a good example. The single transferable vote has a long history of seeing independents elected when that becomes an issue, but it's also possible in these other systems.
Yeah, exactly. I think PR just gives voters what they want. If they want independence, then they can elect independents. Whereas now, independents have no chance, same with
They,
many small parties.
they only get elected in plurality typically as a member of a former party. So, someone falls out with their party, they run as an independent, and, they get elected because people recognize their name. But the party link was pretty important.
I'm a couple of questions have sort of come up about local representation. One of them got sent to me on email, and another one I think I spotted in the list. So instead of trying to, yeah, I'm going to try to sum this up. So somebody's basically saying, proportional representation, the idea is you elect more than one winner. So everybody has to get that. If you're only electing one winner, you're not getting proportional representation no matter how you do it, right? But when you elect more than one winner, does that mean we're losing in a larger district? Does that mean we're losing local representation? Um, would we be foregoing sufficient representation to advance constituents' needs? Is what somebody's asking.
Well, I mean, here you run into a problem, and I want people to really, think this through with me because, often when people talk about local representation, they mean themselves, right? They mean people like me, people on my block, people who vote the way I do. But in every local situation, there is a division of opinion, between the different parties. And each of those parties have a different view of how to serve the local area. So you know, it's tough to get our head around. You can have a smaller geographic area with first past the post, but then you have very partial local representation. Or you can have a larger geographic area But now everyone in that area has got someone they can go to who doesn't just help them with a form for government, but will actually speak to the things that they care about in politics. And this is an absolute trade-off. We cannot avoid this. We have to reckon with these challenges of how do we represent our differences of opinion. And so I think people tend to overestimate the degree to which any local representation is occurring under first past the post. And, again, our conservative friends make a lot of hay about this, but then they turn around and double the size of the local ridings in Toronto. Okay, so you say you care about local representation, but now you've made it twice as hard for community groups to reach their local councillor. So again, I think we've got to approach this critically and try to get a sense of what the trade-offs would be.
I think we had a good case made on the last webinar about the different systems, including in Ireland, just the benefit of having multiple local representatives that you can go to. So there's a little bit of competition um, for service. So you're not spending
Yeah.
3 and 4 months just trying to get an appointment with your MP when it's something they don't want to talk about. I'm not sure what kind of
Yeah.
local representation you're getting in that case. And I can tell you from doing MP visits, that is the case.
Yep.
3 or 4 months.
And what's interesting is that, the irony is that, one of the things we hear about PR is, oh, it's going to affect local representation. One of the complaints that you hear from some of the people in Ireland is there's too much local influence, and that the local members are spending way too much time, working with local people. The other thing is that countries that have a more regional approach to federal representation tend to have a better balance in terms of centralization and decentralization. So when we look at Sweden, Finland, and Norway, now, look at the geography. They look a lot like our Western provinces. They're long and they're narrow, and they have a lot of population concentrated at the bottom, and then people spread out going up north. And what's interesting there is you don't hear these concerns about local representation because they decentralize the decisions that need to be made at the local level effectively to the local level. And, when we talk to politicians from those areas, they all talk about how their parties are very much in touch with people all over the country, taking up their issues because they want their votes, because the votes will count no matter where they're cast. A party has an incentive to respond to that person up in the north or in the interior or in the city center, right? They're not going to discriminate and say, oh, you know what? There's no point in answering you because we don't have a chance of winning that riding, which is what happens in our current situation. But in a PR system, there's always an incentive for the parties to listen to everybody because they want those votes.
Okay, so someone else has a question that they wrote into me. Uh, and again, this brings in a little bit of history here. Not every, I've become aware recently that the whole Justin Trudeau Reform Promise Committee fiasco was 10 years ago now. And so many people have joined the movement since then. They don't have the history of what actually happened. So you're getting all these comments. So Justin Trudeau promised with conviction to implement electoral reform. That was the primary reason I voted for him first time, assuming he was he genuinely wanted change but was unable to advance his agenda. What do you see as the biggest hurdle to achieving meaningful electoral reform?
I've been working on this topic now for 35 years. I study it because it's very interesting, but I also study it because it's incredibly important. I really do think that it's got to be the most important issue democratically. So many of the problems that we look at are rooted in our voting system. And that isn't to say that a PR system, would be paradise. Europe's got lots of problems, but they're hammering them out in a different way than we are doing it. So, Justin Trudeau was very crafty. He said that this will be the last election. He's going to make every vote count. But he already had an idea of the system he wanted. He wanted the ranked ballot alternative vote. That was the system he was prepared to anticipate introducing. And when it was clear that the committee wasn't going to go along with that, he ditched the whole thing. And that is a Liberal Party tradition. 1921, the party promises to introduce PR. Then they don't do it. 1934, they promised to introduce PR. Then they don't do it. 1978, Pierre Trudeau talks about PR. Doesn't do it. 1981, Pierre Trudeau talks about PR. Doesn't do it. I mean, this again and again, the Liberals have pulled up to the PR pump and said, oh, this is a really interesting idea. And then when the crisis passes, so too does the commitment. Of course, the crisis that Trudeau was facing when he made that promise was he was the third party in the House of Commons. For the very first time in the party's history, it wasn't clear that they were going to move back into government or even the opposition as the loyal opposition, as the main opposition. So, he offered it up when he was safely ensconced back in a majority government. Not surprisingly, he was on the outs. Here's our conundrum. At one level, a minority government is a perfect opportunity to press the issue. And so, to the extent that the Greens and the NDP are in favor of the issue, and they say they are, then that's something they could ask from the Liberals. But the problem is that both the Liberals and Conservatives are very similar. They're both the parties of traditional government. They both have traditionally been funded by corporate Canada, even though the Liberals have a very progressive wing. And so there is a very, very strong incentive for them to hang on to the system that gives them all the power, because that's how they return the favors, right? When they get the majority governments, that's when they can return the favors to all the people who gave them all the money. So that's our biggest challenge. I think the United Kingdom is probably a good example of a situation that could be open to voting system reform. You've got the two traditional parties, Conservative and Labour, both facing challenges that could be crippling. So now they're not just looking at losing the next election, they might end up losing forever. And that's usually when you see countries move to PR. When the party system starts to expand and the parties that are used to having power no longer think they will have it, then they have an interest in changing the rules. So in the United Kingdom, you've got the Conservatives facing reform, you've got Labour facing the Greens and maybe a new party on the left. That could lead to some very interesting and overnight changes. That's the other thing to note, right? Is that we hear about how hard it is to change the system, but in almost all the instances I could give you historically, change occurred very quickly. Like British Columbia introduced the alternative vote or the ranked ballot in 1951, literally overnight. The politicians, the two parties that were in power, the Liberals and Conservatives, said, holy crap, the CCF might win on a vote split. We got to change this voting system. And they made it happen. So don't ever believe that it can't happen. What we lack is the political will.
Yeah. How do you respond to concerns about extremism, such as the AfD in Germany?
Well, I mean, I think what we're seeing is that extremism is a matter of point of view. Obviously, I don't like what I see the AfD talking about, but then I don't like what I see Donald Trump talking about. And he is a very good example of the kinds of things that can occur, in plurality voting. The American system is constrained. The two-party system is entrenched, sometimes legislatively. It's not open to third parties. And look what's happening. My view is it's better to see whatever the things that are going on. Extremist parties represent what real people think who voted for them. And I think it's better to see those people and understand them and respond to them than have them hidden in some of the big tent parties where maybe they're getting an influence that we can't see. The point is, in PR, they will never have the power to do what our plurality parties can do without a real majority. And of course, if there's a real majority for fascism, well, the game is up, right? There's not much you can do about that. It's going to happen one way or another. The best defense against democracy is more democracy. If we don't think that Pierre Poilievre is ready to govern, then he shouldn't, until he's got the support to do that. I think a lot of people in the last election were very afraid that 40% of the vote was going to give him 100% of the power. And that worried a lot of people. I think it led to a lot of strategic voting. So the best defense against that is to make sure that doesn't happen. And PR is your best defense against that.
Hey, somebody has a question. Uh, and actually, I hear this one a lot, and I can sympathize with it. That, they're saying, okay, so in 2007, or 2006, the Ontario Citizens Assembly recommended MMP. Basically, if some body, like we'll just use that body for an example, has already decided this is the best system, why do we need more studies?
Well, we
I mean, I
don't.
think we don't.
We don't. I mean, I get a little frustrated with my political science colleagues. It's like they want to debate the weather. Like, really, do we need two sides on the weather? Like, let's just go out and see what the weather is. But it shows you the extremes. The only reason that they talk about it in a kind of two sides way is because there is staunch political opposition to this change. And that political opposition is self-interested. I mean, these are people who don't want the great mass of people to have influence on our politics. They want to limit those people. The kind of politics that gerrymanders ridings in the United States or tries to suppress the voting rights of legitimate voters. I mean, let's look at what we're looking at here. These are unscrupulous and undemocratic efforts. And all of the arguments that favor our current voting system are fundamentally elitist and anti-democratic. They basically say, well, what if the people vote for the wrong things? What if people vote for things I don't approve of as a political scientist? Sorry, that's the risk of democracy. The risk of democracy is that the people may choose something that you don't approve of. So yeah, I don't buy the arguments. I don't think they're compelling.
This is a kind of a, I don't know, yeah, question for the from the last few years. It's a hard question. Do outcomes of PR systems change when the media environment is flooded with misinformation and bad faith arguments?
That's a really good question. A really good question. And we're living through a seismic change in the way that we communicate as a society. Elections have always taken place in a certain kind of media space. You go back to the 19th century, it was the local square and the hustings, and the politicians would show up and they would yell from the platform. It's why they were all barrel-chested, right? Because, they all had to yell, so the public could hear them and people would come into the square. And that direct connection to politicians then eventually gave way to newspapers. And then that eventually gave way to radio and television broadcasts. And everybody would sit down at 6 o'clock and watch the news and find out what happened. And now we're going through, again, a revolution in communication with social media and TikTok and all of these different ways to direct messaging. Parties don't need conventional media, especially those with deep pockets, because they can basically use money to get their messages out. So, no, you're absolutely right. This is a risk. I'm not sure that the situation is any worse in PR than anywhere else. Again, I think that the biggest problem in first past the post is the unpredictable way in which it translates votes into seats. In 1930, the Liberals lost the election with the very same amount that they won the election in 1935. I mean, what is the message here, right? I mean, we have these elections, and then it really just depends on how the votes end up behind different parties, not what the votes actually say. And so ultimately, if you've got an unstable communication system, I think PR is a better option than plurality because PR is more stable. The results will reflect what people have said. And I just say this, it's not like our media systems in the traditional form were always doing such a great job of representing all the views in the public. If you go back to the 1940s and 50s and you read the major newspapers and you look for positive press about the CCF, the precursor for the NDP, you won't find one column inch in favor of the party, even though they had millions of voters. So, those millions of voters managed to find out something and make their choices, even though the media system was not serving them very well.
All right, and this is a familiar question. What are some of the problems with PR in Israel and Italy? And how can Canada avoid them?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so let's all put our political science hats on and let's pretend that we're researchers, looking at a tough question. And so the question is, someone's looked at Israel and Italy and they've said, wow, this looks really crazy. These people are really struggling. This is kind of looks unstable. PR sounds like a bad idea. When we look at any phenomena to research it, we have to be careful not to cherry pick the examples. We want to understand what are the factors that are having a causal effect on the outcomes. So we need to put together a sample of the countries and we need to control for the conditions so that we're comparing like with like. We don't want to compare apples and oranges. So that's the reason why when we make generalizations about how different institutions work, we want to make sure that we're comparing, for instance, Canada with other countries that kind of look like Canada, right? They don't have to be exactly the same, but they need to have a similar kind of political and economic development. And that's why in my book, Wrestling with Democracy, where I look at 18 countries over 150 years, I look at every single instance of national voting system reform, every case. All the countries I chose had a very similar economic and political development to each other. They came to capitalism at a kind of the same time. They opened their legislatures at basically the same time. So that allowed us to try to say, well, what was similar or different in those countries? And that's the problem with Italy and Israel. Both of those countries are really very unique and outliers to the experience in those other places. So if we talk about Israel, I mean, whatever you think about Israel, right or wrong, they think they're at war all the time. And they think they're under attack. And that leads to an approach to politics that is very inclusive. Whenever you're at war, what do? You have a war government and you invite all the parties in because you need to unify against your enemy. And so the Israel political system and their choice of a very, very proportional system reflected their sense of the political priorities for their country. But I'll tell you this, you may think Israel's unstable, but they actually had fewer elections between 1950 and 2010 than we did in Canada. They've had quite a bit of instability in the last little while, and that's just a lesson. No set of institutions will protect you from unpredictable instability. And certainly the last few years have been somewhat unpredictable. But that period from 1950 to 2010, they had fewer elections than we did here in Canada. Now, the number of elections you have is one marker of instability because if the system's unstable, we anticipate that, oh, the parties can't get along, they can't govern, the government's constantly falling, and they have to go back to an election to get the people to sort it out. But that hasn't been the case. And here's another tidbit about Israel. The Labour Party was a part of every single government from 1950 up until the 1980s. And then they were replaced by the Likud, who were part of nearly every government. There was a few changes. But so there's actually been quite a bit of stability in Israel politics, even though there are many parties involved in what goes on. And then, of course, you've got Holland. Holland's gone through some interesting times over the last couple of years, but nobody would suggest that Holland's incapable of governing, that they're too unstable. But their PR system is actually more proportional than Israel. So again, I think we have to be careful about these generalizations. And that's what I would say to people. If people try to pull those up, you say, look, you can't just cherry pick your choices. You can't just look at Zimbabwe, which used first past the post, and say, well, there's a pretty good example about why you shouldn't use first past the post. You're going to end up with that kind of chaos. I mean, it obviously sounds ridiculous. Obviously, what's going on in Zimbabwe is more complicated than just the voting system. But that's kind of what people are saying when they use Italy and Israel. They're kind of saying, oh, we're going to become Israel if we adopt PR. Really? Maybe we'll just become Germany or New
Thanks,
Zealand.
Dennis. I want to go back a little bit to the whole systems and local representation thing. Thanks for everyone for sticking with us. I say we have quite a few more questions, so we're going to stick on here for a little while
Sure,
longer, if that's
I'm
okay.
good with that.
If people are here, so let's do it. So I think some folks are still needing to get their head wrapped around how PR generally works in Canada. I've got somebody saying, would some ridings not have an MP then? How does a riding's representation work under PR? Can you just
What
address that again?
Let me, just take a moment here. There's a lot of questions I could see, and I know some of you are probably frustrated because we're not getting your question. And let me just assure you, if you want to contact me directly with your question, I'm happy to take your question. I mean, obviously, it's nice to have it here with all of us together, but don't worry if you've got something you want to run by me, and I'm happy to respond to any of those. And some of the answers may be in my book, The Politics of Voting, which, as I say, is available absolutely for free on my website, on my Academia EDU website, and you could download the whole thing as a PDF. And it's got an index, so you can look up all kinds of questions in there to deal with this. Let's deal with this representation issue. Whether you're using plurality or majority or proportional representation, they all are designed to give everybody representation in theory. So in theory, all the systems provide people with a representative. That representative may be in a more compact riding where one person is elected, or in a case of proportional, it may be a regional where a number of people are elected, or of course, it could even be a very large geographic area. But the idea is that everyone in whatever the area is has a representative. So there's nobody who does without representation. Everybody has representation under the choice of voting system that we choose. And so then it's just a case of, which choice are we going with? You know, SDV is a really good example. Ireland, what happens there is that it's a multi-member riding. So let's say it's a five-member riding. And what happens is that the parties sort of divide up the multi-member riding into zones. And then the different candidates for the party work those zones, and they go to the door and they say, well, I'm your candidate for so and so, and here's our list of candidates that are running in this multi-member riding. And I'd like you to give me your first choice. And then I'd like you to give my colleague your second choice. And so there's ways in which parties try to adapt to some of the challenges of geography, but then also trying to make every vote count.
I mean, the bottom line is everybody with proportional representation in Canada, you will have local representatives. You will have MPs count for your area that are your MP or MPs that you can contact. And if you don't like one, you'll have another one. And the having that choice is actually really great. I think it keeps them a little bit more on their toes and represents the diversity of the community because I mean, even in rural Alberta, not everybody is a conservative. You know, even in
Yeah.
downtown Toronto, not everybody is a liberal. That's the whole point of proportional representation is that you're going to have an MP for your area that represents your values.
Yeah, and let me just jump in here very quickly. I've made some comments about the political ideas of the Conservative Party, which I don't think have been, that friendly to PR. But let me be clear, I support PR because I want everyone's votes to count. Whether you are a conservative in downtown Toronto, or you are a liberal in suburban Toronto, or you are an NDPer in the north, or whatever is your choice in a democracy, you have a right to that representation. And that's what I'm defending. So let's be clear, you don't have to fall anywhere on the political spectrum to necessarily support this as a democratic initiative.
Exactly. And it's been really great to see some conservatives coming out lately with articles supporting proportional representation, trying to get the party to rethink their blind opposition to it. And, for whatever reasons they are doing that, we welcome those voices of those arguments. Okay, so Fiona is asking, how would I think she means the legislature, bring PR into effect? Would a sitting government move it to a motion? How do
Yeah,
we get
it, it,
PR?
it's just simple legislation. That's all that's
Yeah.
required. There's nothing extraordinary. Our parliamentary system, which of course is drawn from the British system, sometimes called the Westminster system, operates under a principle of responsible government. And the responsible government idea says, look, if you've got a majority of the votes in the legislature, you get to decide what the policy is and you get to pass it. And so a government, if they've got a majority of the votes, then they can go forward and just introduce legislation that would change the voting system from one voting system to another. That's what we did in the previous 10 examples of successful voting system reform at the provincial level in this country historically.
Okay, I have question here. Again, we're circling back a little bit, but it's okay because sometimes it takes a while to get this. I know it took a while for me to understand some of this stuff. So somebody's asking, how are the the party or the reps chosen? They're how do you get these people? I think
So,
it's a variation of that question of do parties just appoint people on a list and that's who you get
yeah.
stuck with, or how does it actually work?
You know, I get it. Like you're here tonight because you are interested. You want to know. You've got questions, and I think that's great and it's important. And but I want to caution you that sometimes our interests are not everyone's interests. And most voters know nothing about how local representatives get chosen by their parties. I mean, really, almost everyone knows nothing about it. And yet, our system continues to function, right? Nobody needs to know that information. What they need to do is feel that whatever their choice is, somehow everything is fair in terms of how it's operating. And Canadians report a very high level of satisfaction with the running of our elections, even if they don't necessarily like the outcomes. And they think they're fair. They think that the people who run them are nonpartisan, and all of that is a really good thing. So I'm sorry, I've lost my train of thought. What was I talking about? It's late Sunday night.
Exactly. Yeah, about how parties.
Oh,
He's
right. How
wondering
they
about how
nominate.
how your
Right.
MPs get elected.
Right.
Who the question we sometimes get, like, who
Right.
fills these PR
Right.
seats? Is it a bunch of party hacks? That kind of
Yeah.
thing, I think.
Well, I mean, it could be just like we get party hacks in our system. So in most PR systems, the decision is left to the parties, just like our system, right? Our system allows parties to make choices about how they make their choices, and then voters can make choices based on how whether they like those choices. So, and what we've seen in this country over time is that as some parties have introduced reforms, it's created a kind of contagion effect. The liberals and conservatives typically would appoint their members. They wouldn't even have a local, campaign. Sometimes they would, sometimes they wouldn't. And then as new parties like the Farmers, the Progressives, and then later the CCF and the NDP would have elections and members, well, then the other parties started doing that too. And so, yeah, PR systems allow the parties to define how they set up their multi-member constituencies in terms of the voting lists or the party lists. But what's interesting is today, most of them have some kind of democratic process where party members will get together in a convention or maybe through some kind of interactive computer or telephone system, and they will rank who they want to be the top candidates on the list or who they want to be the candidates running in an SDV multi-member riding. So again, it really depends, but for the most part, there is fairly transparent accountability in terms of how candidates are chosen in these PR systems.
Yeah. And I mean, I would say too that when you get a ballot with proportional representation, I mean, the systems that we would support in Canada, the systems that most people would support in Canada, you are going to have more choice than you have now. Right now,
Way more.
let's way more choice, right? Right now, it's like, imagine, you sort of like party A, but, their candidate kind of sucks. I'm sorry to be blunt. You can choose that person or that person or that person. You have a party list now. Your party list is one person big. That's the party list you get to choose from. With a proportional system, whether it's a single transferable vote, a mixed member, an open list, you're going to have two or more choices of candidates from the same party. So it actually gives voters more choice, more power about who gets put in the parliament to represent them.
Yeah.
I've had a few questions about sort of similar questions about geography. Some of this is related to proportional representation, and some of it's a little more related to representation by population. But I'm just going to ask the question. So, your last slide mentions that our voting system privileges geography. Is this really true given large urban areas like Toronto and Montreal have the bulk of seats, where rural, remote, and northern regions and territories have very few seats? As a result, the values brought into Parliament are predominantly urban. Can you comment?
So, I mean, look, you're right that there is a division in terms of the representation of geography. And of course, the argument goes both ways, right? Have rural voters say, we're being overwhelmed by, urban voters, and urban voters saying, well, our vote doesn't count as much as rural votes. The rural vote is being exaggerated because rural voters constitute, their ridings are often smaller number of voters in that, even though there's a bigger amount of geography. So everybody's got a side on this in terms of my point is just that when you make the key decision about who gets elected on the basis of a geographic space, you are privileging geography. And the idea behind that is that somehow geography is the most important thing that needs representing. But in fact, over the last 150 years, it's pretty clear that geography is not the most important thing to be represented. Once upon a time, it was. If you go back to the origins of the British House of Commons, it was the Commons was not the common people. It was the Commons, the geographic space in the community that there'd be a market on. And what was important there was that the Lord and the Knight of the Shire, that the merchants were represented in the Commons. They were the important people, not the working class, not the poor. They didn't matter. And so it's important to recognize that when we shifted from geography to ideology, that was a profound shift in terms of what was being represented. And here's the problem, with this whole rural urban thing that we often hear about. We often hear about how, the urbans are dominating us. And yet, all of our political coalitions are coalitions of urban and rural voters. Every single one of them. right? Liberals and conservatives and NDP and Greens, they all have support in urban and rural areas. And importantly, they have very different ideas about how to solve the problems that face rural and urban voters. So there's so many rural voters who aren't getting the representation that they want because really they want to work in common with the urban supporters who have a certain kind of vision of the province or the country that they support, which always includes a rural and urban dimension. So, I think sometimes people are ill served by this idea that, rural areas should be quote unquote overrepresented um, because it ends up being a gerrymander for typically one political party, the conservatives. The conservatives dominate rural representation. It used to be liberals and conservatives. Now it's more conservatives. And I don't think that's serving rural Canada. I think that there is a diversity of views in rural Canada that aren't getting expressed because of this current level of rural misrepresentation. In a PR system, you would see every single one of those rural votes go to support the party that has the rural agenda that that voter supports. And to me, that's the best way to reconcile whatever differences might exist between rural and urban areas.
Okay, we have a couple of questions. Somebody's asking, you know, would proportional representation make our politics less vitriolic and more collaborative?
I can see both sides of this. I think that we have some problems, in this country and in most Western countries that need to be talked about, that need to be said, that are uncomfortable. I think that we do need to talk about race. We do need to talk about Indigenous politics. We do need to talk about class. And how our economic system seems to be disproportionately benefiting those at the top, with not much left, for the people at the bottom, and even the middle. So, so those are going to be uncomfortable and maybe sometimes conflictual conversations. But on the other hand, I think PR, because nobody, no one group can run the show, you got to collaborate. You got to work together if you want to get anything done. And voters often show little patience with parties that don't collaborate effectively. I think this recent Dutch election is a really good example where, the right wing, the extreme right wing party ended up at the top of the heap, got a chance to call the shots and blew it. Didn't do a very good job. Didn't play well with others. And voters said, you know what? I don't want to do that. I mean, they kept lots of votes, but they lost a lot of votes. And other parties who came forward with a more productive, collaborative approach ended up benefiting. And that's the kind of dynamic that I think that we could get with a proportional system in this country. I see opportunities for collaboration with elements of all our parties, but often they're not allowed to because of the incentive structure of first past the post. It means the parties can't give any ground to each other, and that's not working anymore.
Yeah, I have to totally agree. And I mean, there's been a whole bunch of research just in the last 5 years on how proportional systems are less polarized because, when there's not like just two parties or a couple of big parties and a few kind of small parties, it's hard to create this us versus them narrative when you have 10 parties and a lot of nuance. Who's the us? Who's the them? Like the webinar we had talking about Denmark a little while ago was very enlightening, and when the local media in Denmark is reporting that they start months ahead asking all the parties what they want in the budget. And they have these really productive and collaborative conversations until they come out with not just a bare majority support, but major party support for the budget that every year that passes. And this is just the process because when nobody's going to get all the power, then influencing policy becomes the only reason for existing. It's the only game in town. And I would really love to see something like that in Canada. Okay, somebody has a question about increasing the size of parliament. So they're wondering, do we really need more MPs if we have proportional representation?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, I guess that's one of the questions that I think we could probably put to a citizens' assembly. I don't think there's a problem with growing the size of a legislature. I often think that maybe one way to deal with it is, we reduce the pay of the MPs and, we increase, I don't know. There's lots of ways in which we could, I'm kidding in part because one thing I don't do is I don't dump on the individual politicians. It's a thankless job. I wouldn't want to do it. I wouldn't want to be going to meetings, every night, every weekend. They often work very hard. But as I say, I think the structure prevents them from being very, very effective. But I do think there is an argument for increasing the size of the House as populations increase. I think we have a better ratio in Canada than, say, the United States. The United States hasn't increased the size of their lower house since 1913. And yet the population of the country has doubled, over doubled in that period. And what that means is that it's harder and harder for voters to reach the politicians. And the more people that you are asking to reach a politician, the more money you need to participate. So that structurally biases the system in favor of those with wealth. So again, these are trade-offs that we have to think about, but I don't think we should reject it out of hand.
Yeah. We don't necessarily need more MPs to make PR work. There's many ways you can design PR and it doesn't require more MPs, but I mean, it's not necessarily a bad thing either. So somebody is asking, can you comment on the concerns brought up about the complexity of ballots, especially with respect to each PR system? Do other countries with PR have problems with it?
This is a great question because this is a non-issue. It really shows how my colleagues in political science are sometimes not very critical. They take up the talking points of the political parties who don't like PR and uncritically. So here's how I researched this question. We heard from all sorts of people on the various referendums. PR is so complicated. Oh my God, people won't, and our system is so simple, so easy to use. Just mark an X. When in fact, our system is not that easy to understand in terms of explaining why a party with 40% of the votes gets 60% of the seats. Here's the way we test it. If voters were confused by a voting system, then we would expect to see evidence of that. And the evidence would be an increase in the number of spoilt ballots. Spoilt ballots, ballots that are marked incorrectly, have to be turned back in, get a new one, or are rejected at the vote count. So if we were to see, if this idea has legs, we would expect to see PR systems with a higher level of spoilt ballots or rejected ballots. What are the facts? The facts are we don't. Voter errors in balloting are very low in all systems. And there's a reason for that. It's because voters don't go in all by themselves. They usually get prompts from the political parties that they support. And the political parties have an incentive to make sure that their supporters understand how to correctly mark the ballot. So whenever anybody tells you, oh, this will be so confusing and voters won't understand, well, first of all, we have an excellent system of voter support in terms of Elections Ontario or Elections BC or Elections Nova Scotia or Elections Canada. They do great work. And two, the political parties are not going to sit idly by and let their voters be confused, right? If we introduce a new system, you can bet their boots they're going to be working their asses off to make sure that voters understand how to vote their ballots correctly. And we know this, right? From looking at Australia and other countries, they go to great lengths to make sure that voters will understand what they're doing. So it really is a non-issue, right? There is no confusion. There are no risks in terms of simple or complex in terms of the ballots.
All right, we have time for a couple more questions. Someone says, under PR, when citizens have a party to represent their point of view, I believe it will enhance their understanding of politics and issues, elevating the overall level of discourse. Is that a fair view?
Well, I don't think we should, have unrealistic views. It's not going to be Oz. It's not going to be, sunshine and light and kicking up our heels. I mean, PR will make a dramatic impact on our system, but it won't turn people into political geeks. It's not everyone's going to become like us, right? And want to know all this stuff. But it does stand to reason that voters who can connect with the party will feel a sense of connection to the political system more than if they don't. And so in that sense, I do think that the research that's been done on PR systems demonstrates that, yeah, there are some very interesting differences that occur. But overall, people across Western countries, politics is not their full-time job. It's something they do once in a while. They care about it. They want their countries or provinces or cities to run well. Um, but on the other hand, they've got hobbies and other things they're doing.
We can't assume that just because we get PR, everybody's going to become a fountain of political knowledge icon. But yes, there is research showing that overall voters in PR countries do have higher levels of political knowledge. It's nice that when they can find a party that they identify with and feel good about supporting and see that support translate into seats. I mean, that's what PR does.
Yeah.
So I'm going to finish off with some of the last questions where people are asking basically, what can we do to help? How do we get this? How do we get past that, you know, the dilemma that the turkeys aren't going to vote for Thanksgiving, that kind of thing. So I'll just read the last question. Are you optimistic that Canada will ever adopt a proportional voting system? What conditions would be necessary to bring about a change? How can we move towards such a change?
Wow, there's a lot in that question. And before I
There
answer
is.
it, I just want to reiterate that, I know a lot of you, thank you all for spending this evening with me and Anita. We're kind of a team show here. You got lots of other things you could have done. Going forward, don't forget, you can contact me with any of the questions we didn't get to tonight. Um, as I say, I've been working on this a long time, and I kind of feel like I did about the Blue Jays. It's like I wanted them to win. They seem to be doing so well, but it's hard for me to watch the playoffs because it's just too stressful. And it's kind of like that with whether or not what's there's a lot of accident involved in political history, but not completely random. And so, if we look at the characteristics of a polity that is about to change its voting system, there are a couple of things that often occur. One is that there's an increase in the size of the party system. And that was happening at the federal level in Canada over the last 30 years. And that's why we kept coming back to the question, because Canadians kept saying, no, I don't just want to vote for two parties. This last election is a rather disturbing development because the move towards a two-party system pretty much will probably kill off the discussion. Um, and I'm not sure that really reflects what Canadians want. I don't believe that Canadians really want a two-party system, but I do feel that a lot of people were frightened about what they've seen in the United States, what they've seen from some of our parties in this country, and they voted strategically for the best of the worst. And so that's, it's bad. It's bad democratically for us to go down that route. So I think moving back to a situation of multi-party competition is the best thing that we can hope for in terms of creating the openings. And then sometimes there is a legitimacy crisis where the politicians are kind of forced to make a change. And so, we're all waiting for that opening, right? We're waiting for something to break. Again, no guarantee that that there'll be a contagion. We did have those two semi-proportional systems historically, and they didn't lead to a change anywhere else. And so, there is that factor. But all we can do is keep doing what we're doing. And I'd like to end with maybe a little bit of advice. You've come here tonight because you want to know about PR and you're really interested in it. But in my years of talking about this topic, there are a couple of things that are do's and don'ts. And the most important thing in talking to anybody about voting system reform or PR is you've got to find the hook for them. You've got to find the thing about the topic that appeals to what they want to see happen in politics, because that will help them ride out all the other stuff, right? If you are trying to talk to people about PR and it's all uphill, well, what about, chaos? What about how do they, if someone's hitting you up with the minutia of the questions, what they're really telling you is, I'm not that interested in this. I'm just finding excuses not to like it. You need to plant the seed of how this answers a problem that the voters already think they have. I'm mad about this. I'm unhappy about this. I don't like this. That's what you need to link PR to, because that is what will sustain their interests. And that is what will help them hold the critiques and say, well, wait a minute. I'm not prepared to flush this down the toilet just yet. Seems to me like there's some promise here. And it'll help them make the effort. It'll help them have the patience to look a little further rather than look for the first thing that will help them dismiss it. And the other thing, if I can give you any advice, humble me, I mean, who am I to tell you, is don't jump in at the deep end of the details. I know you want to know it, and that's admirable, but most people don't, right? And most people are going to walk away stunned, because it's not familiar to them, right? I mean, the only reason they think our system is simple is because they've always used it. But if you go to someone in Sweden and say, well, look, this is the way we're going to do things, they're going to be, what? Why? Why do that? Well, what's the reasoning for that? Why should we do it that way? Because they're not used to it. So it's really important that you try to match those two things in your advocacy. Finding the hook that is the interest for the person, addressing what they really want in politics, and feeding out the details, as much as is necessary for any particular opportunity.
Yeah. I mean, and I just want to back up what Dennis is saying, about there have been a couple of polls since May showing that even though Canadians basically voted for a two-party system, they don't want a two-party system. And in terms of the biggest hook that I'm seeing right now is we don't want to go down the path of the United States. We don't want our politics, no matter what party you support, we don't want it to become so hopelessly polarized that they couldn't agree over whether a piece of toast is white, to save their lives. They're going to get in a fight in the street about it. And, there's enough research to show that winner take all voting makes that stuff worse to get people's attention with that right now. And I would say, the other thing I saw, I'm seeing some of the comments pop up and somebody's saying, well, 10 years ago, people were interested in this. When they're interested when a politician talks about it, because that gives them hope. It gives them hope that someone in the political leadership is paying attention. And that's why your work in Fair Vote Canada is so important. I mean, it's important that you come to this webinar, but the reason it's important you come to this webinar is because it's important that you do something after this webinar, not just so that you listen to Dennis and I was as entertaining as I'm sure that is, not really, but um, so we are looking for people to visit their MPs, especially the new Liberal MPs. Don't assume they are closed-minded. We worked really hard during the leadership race with Mark Carney to get people in front of him at those events asking him the question, and he has said repeatedly that he is open-minded. So after 10 years of a closed door with Justin Trudeau, who was an absolute opponent of proportional representation, we have a prime minister now who has said that he has an open mind. This is the time to go and talk to your new Liberal MP and talk to them about some of this research about polarization. And you'll find out that some of them are human beings who are just as concerned about this as you are. And we are getting a good response and we're doing the groundwork for when that opportunity moment opens up again. And it's because people like you are willing to do it, that we always have a chance.